The wedding of the decade was designed to be Eleanor Winthrop's masterpiece, a cold, calculated erasure of her son's greatest mistake. She had orchestrated every detail, from the hand-painted lilies to the seating chart designed to maximize pain. To ensure her victory was absolute, Eleanor personally penned an invitation to Caitlin Hart, the waitress girl her son Parker had once loved. It wasn't a gesture of peace, it was a front-row seat to her destruction. Eleanor wanted Caitlin to watch as Parker traded his soul for a tech merger bride, unaware that Caitlin was bringing a secret that would turn their champagne into ash. The envelope sat on Caitlin Hart's scarred oak kitchen table like a dormant landmine. It was crafted from heavy, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of paper that cost more than Caitlin's monthly grocery budget. The calligraphy was embossed in shimmering gold leaf, the elegant loops of the letters P and B swirling together in a way that made her stomach churn. Parker Winthrop and Brianna Vanderbilt. Caitlin's fingers trembled as she traced the raised ink. Beside her, a lukewarm cup of coffee sat forgotten. The morning sun filtered through the small window of her apartment in South Boston, illuminating the peeling paint on the windowsill and the toy wooden train resting on the floor. For 4 years she had built a fortress of silence around her heart. She had survived the whispers, the double shifts at the diner, and the exhausting nights of paralegal school. She had thought she was safe. But Eleanor Winthrop was a woman who didn't believe in safety for others. She believed only in conquest. Caitlin flipped the card over. There, on the back, was a handwritten note in jagged, aggressive cursive that she recognized instantly. It was the handwriting of a woman used to signing checks that ended lives and started wars. I thought you should see what real happiness looks like. Do come. We've reserved a seat in the back row for old time's sake. Eleanor. The words were a physical blow, a dagger wrapped in silk. Caitlin closed her eyes, and suddenly she wasn't in her cramped kitchen anymore. She was back in the rain. It was 4 years ago, a night so dark the sky seemed to be mourning. Parker had come to her studio apartment, looking pale and hollowed out. He had sat on her tattered sofa, refusing to meet her gaze, his hands clutching a silver vintage pocket watch, a family heirloom Eleanor had given him that morning to remind him of his duty. "I can't do it, Kate," he had whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Mother, she showed me the ledger. If I don't marry within the circle, she'll liquidate the trust. She'll fire every person in the foundation. She'll destroy us." "Is that what I am to you, Parker? A threat to your inheritance?" Caitlin had asked, her voice eerily calm despite the tectonic plates of her world shifting beneath her. "No, you're my life," he'd sobbed, yet he didn't move toward her. But her world. "It's different. She says we have to be realistic. She says love is a luxury we can't afford right now." That night, Caitlin hadn't begged. She hadn't screamed at him to stay. She had seen the cowardice in the set of his shoulders and the way he clung to that silver watch, a tether to a life of gilded cages. She had simply opened the door and let the cold rain wash him out of her life. She had kept her dignity even as she felt her heart splinter into a million unrecognizable pieces. But the real blow had come 3 weeks later. The morning sickness had arrived like a ghost at the feast. By the time Caitlin saw the 2 pink lines on the test, Parker was already in the Swiss Alps on a healing retreat orchestrated by Eleanor. Caitlin had tried to call the Winthrop estate once. A cold, clipped voice, Eleanor's, had answered the line. "Listen closely, girl," Eleanor had said, her tone as sharp as a razor. "Parker has moved on. If you ever attempt to contact him again, I will tie you up in litigation until you are homeless. You were a placeholder, a summer distraction. Do not mistake a fling for a future." Caitlin had hung up and never called again. She had protected her sons from that toxicity for 4 years, raising them in the quiet dignity of hard work. "Mama." A small, sleepy voice broke her trance. Caitlin turned to see Leo, 4 years old, rubbing his eyes as he leaned against the doorframe. Right behind him was his identical twin, Oliver. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Looking at them was like looking at a ghost. They had Parker's dark, unruly curls. They had the same piercing, cerulean blue eyes that had once looked at Caitlin with such adoration. But they had her jaw, stubborn, set, and unyielding. "I'm here, baby," Caitlin said, her voice softening as she scooped Leo into her arms. She looked from her sons back to the invitation. Eleanor Winthrop had poked the bear. She had invited Caitlin to the lion's den, expecting to see a broken middle-class mouse seeking a handout. Eleanor wanted to parade her new daughter-in-law, a Vanderbilt heiress in Vera Wang, in front of the waitress Parker had once lowered himself to date. A new cold fire ignited in Caitlin's chest. For years, she had focused on survival. She had finished her degree, she was working at a reputable firm, and she had built a life. She didn't need the Winthrop money, but she realized she owed her sons the truth, and she owed Eleanor a lesson in the one thing money couldn't buy: authenticity. She reached for her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Sarah?" Caitlin said, her voice steady and dangerous. "It's Kate. I need a dress, not a department store dress. I need something that looks like a midnight storm, and I need 2 miniature tuxedos. We're going to a wedding in Greenwich." As she hung up, Caitlin looked at the silver pocket watch Parker had accidentally left behind 4 years ago, still sitting in a velvet box on her shelf. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she looked at the twins. The Winthrops were obsessed with time and legacy. It was time they met theirs. The Winthrop estate in Greenwich was less a home and more a monument to the endurance of old money. Tall, manicured boxwood hedges stood like silent sentinels along the winding cobblestone driveway, their sharp edges a testament to the precision Eleanor Winthrop demanded from the world. A fleet of luxury vehicles, black Bentleys, silver Ferraris, and vintage Rolls-Royces, were parked in perfect geometric rows, their polished surfaces gleaming under the oppressive heat of the afternoon sun. The air here smelled different. It was a thick, cloying mixture of expensive French perfume, freshly cut grass, and the cold metallic scent of ancient wealth. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was even more stifling. Crystal chandeliers, heavy enough to crush a man's spirit, cast fractured diamond-like patterns across the white marble floors. Eleanor Winthrop held court near the center of the room. She was draped in a floor-length gown of shimmering silver silk that moved like mercury, hugging a frame that had been hardened by decades of social warfare. Around her neck sat a collar of diamonds that had been in the family since the Gilded Age. Stones so heavy they seemed to pin her to the spot, though she moved with the predatory grace of a hawk. "Is everything perfect, Margaret?" Eleanor asked, her voice a low, melodic purr that nonetheless carried the weight of a command. She sipped vintage champagne from a fluted glass, her eyes scanning the room for even the slightest imperfection. Margaret, a socialite whose face had been pulled into a permanent expression of mild surprise by years of cosmetic procedures, nodded vigorously. "Impeccable, Eleanor, truly. Parker looks dashing. And Brianna? That dowry tech merger will be the talk of the journal for months. It's a match made in heaven." "It is a match made in the ledger, which is far more reliable than heaven," Eleanor corrected, a cold smile touching her lips. Parker needed to understand that a Winthrop doesn't marry for a feeling. A Winthrop marries for a future. "I've spent 30 years sculpting him. I wasn't about to let a summer fling with a waitress turn my masterpiece into a caricature." Margaret lowered her voice, a glint of malice in her eyes. "And the invitation. Did you really send one to the girl?" Eleanor laughed, a sharp tinkling sound that held no warmth. "I did. I wanted her to see the scale of her failure. I want her to stand in the back of this room in her cheap department store polyester and look at Sophia Vanderbilt in custom Vera Wang. I want Parker to look at her one last time and realize that I didn't just break them up. I saved him from a life of mediocrity. At the front of the ballroom, standing before an altar of white roses that smelled of funerals, was Parker Winthrop. He looked every bit the billionaire heir in his bespoke tuxedo, but to anyone who actually knew him, he looked hollowed out. His skin was unnervingly pale, and his eyes, the same blue eyes that would soon be seen elsewhere, were vacant. He moved like a marionette, shaking hands with men whose names he couldn't remember and nodding at women who looked exactly like his mother. He felt the weight of the silver pocket watch missing from his vest. He had lost it the night he left Caitlin, and Eleanor had never let him forget it. To her, it was a symbol of his carelessness. To him, it was the moment the clock stopped. 5 miles away, a black SUV pulled onto the shoulder of the road. Inside, the silence was thick with anticipation. Sarah, Caitlin's oldest friend, sat in the driver's seat, her hands gripped tight on the wheel. She turned to look at Caitlin, and for a moment she didn't recognize her. Caitlin wasn't wearing polyester. She was wearing a floor-length gown of midnight blue velvet that Sarah had spent the last 48 hours tailoring to perfection. The fabric was so dark it seemed to absorb the light, hugging Caitlin's curves before flaring out into a subtle, regal train. Her shoulders were bare, her skin glowing like porcelain against the deep fabric. Her hair was swept up into an elegant architectural chignon, secured by a single silver pin. But it was the earrings that changed her. Long, diamond drops, a gift from a client she had successfully defended in a landmark fraud case that caught the light every time she moved her head. She didn't look like a waitress. She looked like a conqueror. "Are you sure about this, Kate?" Sarah whispered. "Once those doors open, there's no going back. The Winthrops, they don't just lose, they destroy." Caitlin looked into the rearview mirror. In the back seat, Leo and Oliver were sitting in their booster seats, looking like miniature versions of the man waiting at the altar. Their tiny tuxedos were crisp, their dark hair combed back with just a hint of gel. They were coloring in a book, oblivious to the fact that they were about to walk into a battlefield. "I'm not doing this for a settlement, Sarah," Caitlin said, her voice eerily calm. "I'm doing this because for 4 years I let Eleanor Winthrop tell me I was nothing. I let her tell me my children were a mistake. Today, I'm showing her that she was the one who miscalculated." Caitlin reached into her clutch and felt the edges of the DNA results and the birth certificates. She also felt a small, heavy object, the silver pocket watch. She had decided to bring it, not to give it back, but to show Parker that his time was up. "Let's go," Caitlin commanded. As the SUV pulled into the Winthrop driveway, the valet attendant stepped forward, looking ready to dismiss the vehicle. But when Caitlin rolled down the window, the sheer intensity in her blue eyes made him stumble back. She stepped out of the car, the velvet of her dress catching the afternoon light. She reached back and unbuckled the boys. As Leo and Oliver stepped onto the Greenwich gravel, the world seemed to tilt. Caitlin took each of her sons by the hand. She stood at the base of the grand stairs, looking up at the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. The string quartet inside was playing a light, lilting melody, the sound of a world that thought it was safe. Caitlin took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, not with fear, but with the cold, hard rhythm of justice. She began to walk up the stairs, 2 little boys in tuxedos matching her stride, their Kensington blue eyes fixed on the doors. She didn't sneak in. She didn't bow her head. "Wait here for the music to swell," Caitlin whispered to the boys. Inside, the officiant cleared his throat. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Parker Winthrop and Brianna Vanderbilt." Caitlin placed her hands on the heavy oak handles. This was the turning point. She wasn't just an ex-girlfriend anymore. She was the ghost that Eleanor had tried to bury, and she was about to haunt them all. With a forceful shove, Caitlin Hart threw open the doors. The heavy oak doors didn't just open. They groaned, a low tectonic sound that cut through the lilting violins of the string quartet like a blade through silk. Usually, a late arrival at a Winthrop event would sneak in with shoulders hunched and eyes downcast, desperate to go unnoticed. But Caitlin Hart did not sneak. She stood framed by the golden afternoon sunlight, the glare of the world behind her, turning her silhouette into something ethereal and imposing. The ballroom, which had been a hum of practiced whispers and expensive jewelry clinking against crystal, fell into a silence so profound it felt physical. It started at the back rows, the seats Eleanor had mockingly reserved for the help, and rippled forward like a wave of ice. Caitlin stepped onto the white marble, the train of her midnight blue velvet dress whispering against the stone. She looked regal, dangerous, and breathtakingly beautiful. But the gasps that filled the room weren't for her dress or the way her diamond earrings caught the light. They were for the two small boys holding her hands. Leo and Oliver walked with a confidence that defied their 4 years. They didn't shrink from the stares of the titans of industry or the scions of old money. They looked around the room with wide, curious eyes, eyes that were a terrifying, undeniable shade of Winthrop blue. Eleanor Winthrop, who was mid-sip of her vintage Krug, froze. For the first time in her 60 years, her composure didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The fluted glass slipped from her gloved hand. It shattered on the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot, the expensive liquid pooling around her silver shoes like a cooling wound. No one looked down at the mess. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the center aisle. Caitlin. Parker's voice was barely a whisper, yet in the vacuum of the room it sounded like a shout. He stepped off the rose-covered altar, stumbling slightly, as if the floor had suddenly tilted. The color drained from his face so rapidly he looked like a statue brought to life only to be drained of its blood. He looked at Caitlin, who stood 10 feet away, her chin tilted at an angle that mirrored his own mother's most defiant poses. And then his gaze dropped to the boys. He saw his own nose. He saw his own chin. He saw the stubborn set of the jaw that had been a Winthrop trait for 3 generations. The silence was broken by the frantic whispering of the best man, Parker's college roommate, who muttered a soft, "Oh my God, Parker, they're clones of you." This was the moment of Eleanor's greatest mistake. Instead of retreating or calculating a graceful exit, she chose the path of the wounded predator. She marched toward Caitlin, her silver silk gown hissing against the floor, her face twisted into a mask of aristocratic fury. "How dare you?" Eleanor hissed, her voice vibrating with a frequency that made the nearby crystal ornaments tremble. "How dare you bring these hired actors into my home to disrupt my son's life? This is a shakedown, a pathetic low-class attempt at a payday." Caitlin didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the guests who were now pulling out their phones, the screens glowing like fireflies in the dim ballroom. "Hired actors, Eleanor?" Caitlin's voice was clear, melodic, and carried to the back of the hall. "I didn't realize the Winthrop features were so easily bought at a casting agency." "Security!" Eleanor shrieked, looking wildly around the room. "Remove this woman and these children immediately. They are trespassing. They are a threat." But the security guards, men who had served the Winthrops for years, stood frozen. They too were looking at the boys. They knew the Winthrop face better than anyone. They weren't looking at a threat. They were looking at the future of the estate. Parker finally found his feet. He pushed past his mother, nearly knocking her into the puddle of champagne. He walked toward Caitlin, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He stopped 3 feet away, his hands trembling as he reached out toward Leo, then pulled back as if afraid the boy would vanish if touched. "Kate!" Parker choked out, his eyes swimming with a sudden, violent realization. Are they? "They turn 4 next week, Parker," Caitlin said, her voice softening just enough for the first few rows to hear. I called the estate the night I found out. I wrote to your apartment in Paris. Your mother told me you were disgusted by our fling. She told me if I ever contacted you again, she'd have me arrested. The room erupted. The mistake was now a public execution of Eleanor's reputation. Brianna Vanderbilt, the bride, stepped forward from the side room, her white veil trailing behind her like a ghost's shroud. She looked at Parker, who was staring at the twins with a look of agonizing love and regret. She looked at Eleanor, who was still trying to summon security with frantic gestures. Finally, she looked at Caitlin. Brianna wasn't a fool. She was a woman of business, and she could see the ledger was no longer in her favor. She reached up, unpinned her veil, and let it fall to the floor. "I think," Brianna said, her voice cold and resonant, "that the merger is off." Eleanor turned to her, her eyes wide. "Brianna, darling, don't listen to this. This creature, it's a trick, a common scam. The only scam here, Eleanor, is the one you played on your own son," Brianna replied, her gaze moving to Parker. "And Parker, you look at those boys and tell me they aren't yours. If you can't even be honest about your own blood, I don't want your name." Brianna turned and walked out of the ballroom, her bridesmaids trailing after her in a flurry of peach-colored silk. Parker didn't watch her go. He didn't care about the tech merger or the Vanderbilt name. He fell to his knees in front of the boys. Leo, the more outgoing of the two, tilted his head and looked at the man in the expensive suit. "Mommy?" Leo asked, his voice high and innocent, cutting through the tension. "Is this the man from the pictures? Is this the man who went away?" The question was more devastating than any insult Caitlin could have hurled. Parker let out a broken sob, his forehead nearly touching the marble. Eleanor saw her world collapsing. She saw the cameras. She saw the judgment on the faces of her peers. And in her desperation, she made her final fatal error of the afternoon. She reached out and grabbed Caitlin's arm, her nails digging into the blue velvet. "You will leave," Eleanor whispered, her face inches from Caitlin's. "I will buy you. I will buy your silence. I will take those boys and I will—" Caitlin leaned in, her voice a cold whisper that only Eleanor could hear. "You have nothing I want, Eleanor. And today, I'm taking the one thing you actually value." Caitlin reached into her clutch and pulled out the silver vintage pocket watch. She held it up so the entire room could see it, the heirloom Eleanor had used to tether Parker to his duty. "You told Parker he lost this because he was careless," Caitlin said aloud. "He didn't lose it. He left it with me the night he chose your money over his heart. I'm not giving it back to you, Eleanor. I'm giving it to my sons. It's their legacy now, not yours." Caitlin placed the watch in Leo's small hand. The boy's eyes lit up at the shiny, ticking object. The image was perfect. A mother's arrogance shattered, a son on his knees, and the mistake holding the family's history in his hands. "Come on, boys," Caitlin said, turning her back on the altar and the woman in silver. "We've seen the show. It's time to go." "Wait!" Parker screamed, scrambling to his feet. "Caitlin, please, don't go." But Caitlin didn't stop. She walked back down the aisle, her head held high, two little Winthrops at her side, leaving the wedding of the decade in ruins. The gravel of the Winthrop driveway crunched under Parker's polished dress shoes as he sprinted past the shocked valet drivers and the row of silent luxury cars. The heat of the afternoon sun beat down on his neck, a stark contrast to the hollow, freezing dread pooling in his stomach. The silver-tongued world he had lived in for 30 years was gone, replaced by the ringing in his ears and the image of two little boys with his own face. "Caitlin!" he shouted, his voice cracking, a raw, unpolished sound that had no place in the refined air of Greenwich. "Caitlin, stop, please!" Caitlin had just finished buckling Leo and Oliver into their booster seats in the back of her sleek black SUV, a car she had bought with her own earnings from 3 years of grueling legal work. She paused, her hand resting on the driver's door handle. She didn't look frightened of him. She didn't even look angry anymore. She looked exhausted, as if she were dealing with a persistent telemarketer rather than the father of her children. She turned slowly, her midnight blue velvet dress catching the light of the sinking sun. "Go back inside, Parker. Your mother is probably having an aneurysm, and the PR team needs someone to tell them what to lie about." "I don't care about the PR team," Parker panted, coming to a halt a few feet away, afraid to get closer. He looked at the tinted back windows of the car, desperate for another glimpse of the boys. "I care about... Are they really? Kate, tell me they're mine." "Don't ask questions you already know the answer to." Caitlin cut him off, her voice sharp and clinical. "You saw them. You saw their eyes. You saw the Winthrop glare. They turn 4 next Thursday." Parker ran a hand through his hair, disheveling the perfect groom styling Eleanor had insisted upon. 4 years, Caitlin. 4 years. Why didn't you tell me? I would have left everything." "I would have come for you." Caitlin laughed, a dry, humorless sound that felt like sandpaper against his skin. She stepped away from the car, closing the distance between them just enough to lower her voice so the children wouldn't hear the poison in her words. "You would have come?" She mocked gently. "Parker, I called you the night I found out. I called the estate line. I called your cell until it was disconnected. I even wrote a letter, a physical, handwritten letter, and sent it to your apartment in the city before you left for Paris." Parker shook his head, his eyes widening in confusion. "I never got a call. I never got a letter. My phone... Mother said it was hacked. She got me a new one before I left for the Alps. She said you had changed your number, that you didn't want to hear from me because I had disappointed you." "Your mother," Caitlin said, spitting the words out like they were toxic, "answered my call on the estate line. She told me that if I ever tried to contact you again, she would bury me in legal fees until I was homeless. She said you were disgusted by our little fling and that you were already seeing Brianna. She returned my letter unopened, Parker with return to sender, stamped in red ink." Parker staggered back as if she'd physically punched him. The memories of that summer in Paris flooded back. How his mother had hovered over him, managing his schedule, filtering his mail, telling him to focus on healing while she took care of the distractions back home. He remembered the way she'd smile as she handed him his new phone, telling him it was a fresh start. "She stole them from me," Parker whispered, horror dawning on his face as the magnitude of Eleanor's crime hit him. "She stole my sons. She tried to steal them from me too," Caitlin said, her eyes flashing with a fire that made the diamond drops in her ears sparkle like ice. "Do you know what it's like to raise twins alone while putting yourself through law school? Do you know what it's like to buy formula with spare change while watching your ex-boyfriend on the news, attending galas on yachts? I didn't just build a career, Parker. I built a fortress. Law school?" Parker looked at her, really looking at her for the first time. He saw the confidence, the expensive car, the way she carried herself not as a victim, but as an equal. "I own Hart and Associates," Caitlin said with a grim sense of satisfaction. "I specialize in corporate fraud and family law. I built my life from the ashes your mother left behind. I don't need your money, Parker, and I certainly don't need your pity. I came today because she had the audacity to mock me with an invitation. I wanted her to see what her realism actually cost her." "Kate, wait." Parker stepped forward, his hand reaching out, not daring to touch the velvet of her sleeve. "What happens now? You can't just show me my sons and then drive away. I'm their father." Caitlin opened her door and looked back over her shoulder. The silver pocket watch was still in Leo's hand inside the car, the rhythmic ticking a countdown to the end of the Winthrop era. "You made your choice 4 years ago when you let her decide your future," Caitlin said. "You wanted the easy life. Well, you have it. Go marry Brianna, if she'll still have you. Merge your companies. Be the good little Winthrop heir." "I can't marry her now," Parker cried out. "Caitlin, don't you dare say you love me." She stopped him, her voice dropping an octave. "You don't love me. You love the idea of defying your mother, but you've always been too weak to actually do it. Goodbye, Parker." She slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, a powerful, deep rumble that drowned out his pleas. As she pulled away, kicking up dust onto his bespoke tuxedo, Parker stood alone in the driveway. He felt a hollowness in his chest that no amount of Vanderbilt tech merger stock could ever fill. He turned around and looked back at the manor. The wedding guests were spilling out onto the terrace, whispering, pointing, and recording. He saw his mother, Eleanor, standing at the top of the stairs, her silver gown shimmering like fish scales. She was already on her phone, barking orders, trying to kill the story before it hit the morning edition. Parker didn't feel sadness anymore. The sadness had evaporated, replaced by a white-hot rage he hadn't known he was capable of. He wasn't going back into the ballroom to apologize. He wasn't going to help her salvage the merger. He marched back toward the venue, his eyes fixed on the woman who had stolen 4 years of his life. He wasn't going to the altar. He was going to war. Inside the bridal suite of the Winthrop Manor, the air was thick with the suffocating scent of 10,000 dying white roses. The room, designed for a celebration of a union, had become a bunker. Eleanor Winthrop was pacing the length of the silk-covered floor, her silver gown shimmering like a dying star. She wasn't weeping. Eleanor didn't possess the tear ducts for such a common display. Instead, she was barking orders into her encrypted phone, her voice a sharp, jagged staccato. "I don't care about the cost, Maximilian. Kill the story. Buy the servers if you have to. Tell the press it was a disgruntled former employee with a penchant for theater. Tell them the children were a deep fake projection." She slammed the phone down onto a mahogany vanity just as the door splintered. Parker didn't knock. He kicked the door open with a force that sent a shiver through the gilded mirrors lining the walls. He stood in the doorway, his bespoke tuxedo stained with the dust of the driveway, his tie ripped away, and his eyes, usually so compliant, burning with a white-hot, terrifying clarity. "Parker, thank God," Eleanor said, smoothing her hair with a practiced hand. She tried to summon her motherly mask, but the corners of her mouth twitched. "Listen to me, we can still salvage this. Brianna is upset, but her father is a pragmatist. If we issue a statement immediately denying paternity and questioning the mental stability of that woman—" "Shut up," Parker said. His voice wasn't loud. It was dangerously quiet, a low vibration that seemed to rattle the crystal perfume bottles on the vanity. Eleanor froze, her spine stiffening. "Excuse me." I said, "Shut up, Mother." Parker walked into the room, each step deliberate. He looked at the woman who had controlled his every breath, his every meal, and his every relationship for 30 years. "You knew. You knew she was pregnant 4 years ago. You answered the calls. You intercepted the letters. You watched her struggle from your ivory tower while you sent me to Paris to heal." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, her eyes narrowing into icy slits. "I protected you, Parker. She was a waitress, a nobody from a 3-decker in Southie. She would have dragged you down into a life of mediocrity, of car payments and coupons. I did what was necessary to preserve the Winthrop legacy." "Legacy?" Parker laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that bordered on manic. He reached down and twisted the heavy gold signet ring off his right finger, the Winthrop crest, a symbol he had been told to cherish since his 18th birthday. "You talk about legacy while you ensure that your only grandsons grow up hating your name. You didn't buy me a future, Mother. You bought me a cage." He threw the ring onto the floor. It clattered against the marble, a small hollow sound that marked the end of an era. "The wedding is off. The merger is dead. And if you ever attempt to go near Caitlin or those boys, I will burn this entire estate to the ground with us both inside." He turned and walked out, leaving Eleanor standing alone in a room full of unused flowers. For the first time in her life, she felt the cold grip of something she had never experienced, a loss of control. By the next morning, the scandal didn't just break, it exploded. The video of Caitlin walking down the aisle with the twins had been viewed 20 million times. The hashtags #TheWaitressRevenge and #WinthropTwins were trending globally. The internet, usually a fractured and cynical place, was almost unanimously on Caitlin's side. The image of the regal self-made mother protecting her children against the Silver Queen was too perfect a narrative to resist. Caitlin sat in her office at Hart & Associates 3 days later. It was a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston skyline, a view she had earned through 80-hour work weeks and sheer unadulterated grit. Her desk was covered in files, but her eyes were glued to the television mounted on the wall. Winthrop Industries stock has plummeted 15% since the disastrous wedding event, the news anchor reported. Investors are questioning the stability of the leadership after CEO Eleanor Winthrop was accused of concealing her own grandchildren. Meanwhile, sources say Parker Winthrop has checked into a hotel and has not spoken to his mother since Saturday. Caitlin muted the TV. She felt a headache building behind her eyes. She hadn't done this for fame. She had done it for closure. But she knew Eleanor Winthrop wouldn't go quietly into the night. Her intercom buzzed. "Ms. Hart, there's a visitor for you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent. She's wearing a veil." Caitlin's muscles tensed. "Send her in." The door opened, and Brianna Vanderbilt, the jilted bride, stepped inside. She had traded her Vera Wang for a sharp, charcoal-grey power suit, but her eyes were red and puffy. She looked like a woman who had spent 72 hours staring at the wreckage of her life. "I didn't come to yell at you," Brianna said quietly, dropping into the chair opposite Caitlin's desk without being asked. "Then why are you here, Brianna?" "To thank you," Brianna said, her voice trembling slightly. "If I had married him and found out later, or if I'd had children with him and that woman tried to control them the way she controls Parker. I saw the way she looked at your boys, Caitlin. She didn't look at them like grandchildren. She looked at them like livestock to be branded for the family brand." Brianna reached into her designer bag and pulled out a slim silver flash drive. She slid it across the mahogany desk. "What is this?" Caitlin asked. "My father was humiliated, and a Vanderbilt doesn't take humiliation lightly," Brianna explained. "He had his private investigators dig into Eleanor's past dealings to find leverage for the exit clause of our merger, but I think you need this more than we do." Caitlin plugged the drive into her computer. Her breath hitched as the files populated the screen. "What am I looking at?" "Proof," Brianna whispered. "Proof that Eleanor didn't just hide the letters. She accessed your medical records illegally. She paid off a clerk at the clinic where you had your first ultrasound. She knew the gender of those babies before you did, Caitlin. She's been tracking you for years, waiting for a moment to intervene if you ever became a problem." A chill ran down Caitlin's spine. The idea that Eleanor had been lurking in the shadows, watching her struggle to pay rent while knowing exactly where her grandsons were, was nauseating. "Why give this to me?" "Because she's not done," Brianna warned. "I heard my father talking to his lawyers. Eleanor is planning to file for emergency custody. She's going to claim you are mentally unstable and that you staged the wedding interruption to emotionally damage the children. She's going to try to take the boys, Caitlin. She needs heirs to stabilize the stock price, and she's decided to bypass Parker entirely." Caitlin's hand closed tight around the flash drive, her knuckles turning white. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by the cold, sharp instinct of a wolf protecting her cubs. "Let her try," Caitlin said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I know the law better than she does, and this time I'm not the scared 20-year-old she bullied. This time, I'm the one with the evidence." Just then, Caitlin's phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Ms. Hart," a deep, smooth voice spoke. "This is Arthur Sterling, representing Mrs. Eleanor Winthrop. I'm calling to inform you that we have filed an emergency motion for temporary custody of Leo and Oliver Hart. We expect you to surrender their passports by 5 p.m. today, or we will have a warrant for your arrest for parental alienation." Caitlin smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that would have made Eleanor Winthrop shudder. "Arthur, tell Eleanor to wear something comfortable tomorrow," Caitlin said. "It's going to be a very long day in court." The courtroom was a cavernous space of dark mahogany and cold marble, smelling of floor wax and the ancient dusty weight of precedent. It was packed to capacity. Eleanor Winthrop hadn't just hired the most aggressive legal team in the state. She had leaked the hearing time to the press. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted the world to see her rescue her poor, neglected grandchildren from the clutches of a vengeful, unstable woman. Eleanor sat at the plaintiff's table, looking the picture of elegant grief. She wore a modest black suit, her usual diamonds replaced by a simple, understated gold chain. She dabbed at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief every time a camera shutter clicked in the gallery. Beside her sat her lead counsel, Mr. Montgomery, a man known in legal circles as the Butcher for his ability to tear families apart for the right price. Caitlin sat alone at the defense table. She didn't need a lawyer. She was one. She wore a sharp, crimson blazer, the color of a warning light that signaled she wasn't there to mourn. She was there to fight. "All rise!" the bailiff bellowed. Judge Keller, a stern woman with a reputation for zero tolerance of courtroom theatrics, swept in. She looked at the overflowing gallery and frowned. "This is a family court, not a circus. One outburst and I clear the room. Mr. Montgomery, you're opening." Montgomery stood up, buttoning his jacket with a smug click. He walked toward the bench, his voice dripping with faux concern. "Your Honor, we are here today because a tragedy has occurred. 2 innocent children, heirs to one of the country's most significant legacies, have been hidden away in poverty by a mother whose judgment is clouded by bitterness. Ms. Hart withheld the existence of these children from their father and grandmother for 4 years. She lives in a 2-bedroom rental. She works long hours. We are asking for immediate temporary custody to be granted to Mrs. Eleanor Winthrop, where the boys can receive the security, education and medical care they deserve." He turned to look at Caitlin with a sneer. "These children are Winthrops. They should not be punished for their mother's pride." Caitlin didn't flinch. When it was her turn, she stood up slowly, her movements precise. "Your Honor," Caitlin said, her voice steady and resonant. "Mr. Montgomery speaks of legacy and heirs. I speak of children. Leo and Oliver are happy, healthy and loved. They don't know who the Winthrops are, and frankly, up until 3 days ago, the Winthrops didn't care to know who they were." "Objection!" Montgomery barked. "My client didn't know they existed." "Didn't she?" Caitlin challenged. "I would like to submit Exhibit A." She walked to the bench and handed over a stack of documents, the printouts from the flash drive Brianna had provided. "These are invoices," Caitlin explained, turning to face the gallery so the reporters could see the headers. "Dated 4 years ago, paid by a shell company owned by Winthrop Industries. They are payments to a clerk at the Boston Women's Clinic and to a private security firm. The dates coincide exactly with my prenatal checkups. Mrs. Winthrop knew I was pregnant. She knew I was carrying twins. She knew their gender, and she chose to hide that information from her own son to ensure he went through with a business merger. She didn't just ignore them. She monitored them like assets on a balance sheet." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Eleanor's face went pale, the silk handkerchief frozen against her cheek. "This is fabricated." "Hearsay!" Montgomery shouted. "I have the bank routing numbers, Your Honor," Caitlin said calmly. "But if you need a character witness to establish Mrs. Winthrop's fitness as a guardian, I would like to call the boy's father to the stand." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Parker Winthrop walked in. He looked terrible. He hadn't shaved in days, and he was wearing a simple, wrinkled button-down shirt instead of his usual bespoke suits. He looked like a man who had finally seen the sun after a lifetime in a basement. Eleanor stood up halfway. "Parker, don't you dare!" "Sit down, Mrs. Winthrop," Judge Keller snapped. Parker took the stand. He wouldn't look at his mother. He looked only at Caitlin. "Mr. Winthrop," Caitlin asked, treating him with a professional distance that clearly pained him. "Did you know about your sons?" "No," Parker said, his voice raspy. "I didn't. I was told she moved away. I was told she didn't want to see me." "And would you say your mother is a fit guardian for Leo and Oliver?" The room went silent. Parker looked at Eleanor. He thought about the letters she'd burned, the calls she'd blocked, and the way she had tried to buy a bride for him like she was buying a piece of real estate. "No," Parker said clearly. "My mother loves control more than she loves people. She doesn't want custody of Leo and Oliver because she loves them. She wants them because her stock prices are dropping and she needs good PR. She views them as props to stabilize a company she's currently running into the ground." "Parker!" Eleanor shrieked, losing her composure entirely. "I did it for you." "You did it for yourself," Parker countered. But Caitlin wasn't finished. "Your Honor, there is one more thing. The funds used to pay for the illegal surveillance of my medical records and the hush money to the clinic. They weren't personal funds. According to these logs, they were siphoned from the Winthrop Industries Employee Pension Fund." The gasp that went through the room this time was different. It wasn't just scandal. It was the sound of a criminal realization. Eleanor had committed corporate fraud to fuel her personal vendetta. Judge Keller slammed her gavel, her face set in a mask of disgust. "Mrs. Winthrop, your motion for emergency custody is denied. Furthermore, based on the evidence of medical privacy violations and potential financial crimes, I am issuing a temporary restraining order. You are to stay 500 feet away from Ms. Hart and her children. I am also referring this evidence to the district attorney for a full investigation into your corporate expenditures." "This is an outrage!" Eleanor screamed, her voice cracking. "I am Eleanor Winthrop. You can't do this." "I just did," Judge Keller said. "Court is adjourned." As the officers moved to escort Eleanor out, not as a queen, but as a suspect, Caitlin felt the first breath of true air she'd had in 4 years. She walked out of the courthouse, and for the first time, she didn't walk alone. Parker was waiting for her on the steps, shielding her from the flashing cameras. "Thank you," she said stiffly as they reached her car. "I meant what I said," Parker told her, his eyes searching hers. "I don't want to take them from you, Kate. I just want the chance to earn my way into their lives, not as a Winthrop, just as me." Caitlin looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man she had loved before the money and the mother had suffocated him. "Saturday," she said finally. "We go to the park at 10. If you're late, don't bother coming." "I'll be there at 8. Parker promised. Saturday arrived with a soft, golden haze that settled over the Boston Public Garden. It was a day meant for leisure, but for Parker Winthrop, it was the most harrowing morning of his life. He arrived at the park at 8 a.m. exactly as he had promised, though he looked nothing like the scion who had once graced the covers of business magazines. The reality of his defiance had hit hard. Within 48 hours of the court hearing, Eleanor had frozen his trust funds, revoked his access to the family accounts, and had his company car repossessed from the hotel parking lot. For the first time in his 30 years, Parker had exactly $400 in his pocket and no credit cards. He had arrived at the park after taking 3 different buses, a journey that had left him sweaty, disheveled, and deeply humbled. He carried a plastic bag from a discount toy store containing 2 simple push-along dump trucks. Caitlin arrived at 10 a.m. sharp. She found him sitting on a green wooden bench, clutching the plastic bag as if it were a life raft. She was dressed in a casual linen shirt and jeans, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, a stark contrast to the midnight velvet conqueror of the wedding. She saw the crumpled bus ticket stubs sticking out of his pocket and the way his expensive dress shoes were scuffed from the walk. She didn't smile, but her eyes lacked the razor-sharp edge of the courtroom. She simply pointed to the empty space on the bench. "You took the bus." Parker let out a nervous, self-deprecating laugh. "It's a lot louder than a limo, and the air conditioning is more of a suggestion than a feature. Why didn't you drive?" "Mother took the cars," Parker admitted, looking down at his hands. "She took everything, Kate. The apartment, the access, the name. I'm currently sleeping on my college roommate Dave's couch. I have a job interview on Monday for a junior analyst position at a firm she doesn't own. It pays garbage, but it's mine." Caitlin stared at him, searching for any hint of the old Parker, the one who would have folded at the first sign of discomfort. She found none. "You could have apologized to her. She would have given it all back." "I'd rather be poor and able to look at my sons without shame," Parker said, his voice thick with conviction. "I missed their first steps because I was a coward. I'm not missing anything else." "Mommy, look, ducks!" The twins came racing across the grass, their small legs moving in a blur of energy. They stopped short when they saw Parker. Leo, always the leader, narrowed his eyes. "Is that the man from the house, the one who was crying?" Parker winced, but he didn't look away. "Yeah, Leo, I was the crying man. My name is Parker. I brought you something." He reached into the bag and handed over the plastic trucks. They weren't the gold-plated, battery-operated marvels Eleanor would have sent. They were simple, bright yellow, and made of cheap plastic. Leo's face lit up as if he'd been handed the keys to the kingdom. "Ollie, look! Dump trucks!" Within seconds, the two boys were on their knees in the dirt, making engine noises and completely accepting the man who had brought them. Parker let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 4 years. Tears pricked his eyes, but he wiped them away quickly, not wanting to scare them. "They like them," Caitlin said softly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sandwich wrapped in foil, breaking it in half and handing a piece to him. "Eat. You look like you haven't had a meal since the hearing." It was peanut butter and jelly. To Parker, it tasted better than any 5-course meal at the Winthrop estate. For a few hours, the world felt balanced. They talked, not about lawyers or legacies, but about the boys' favorite cartoons and the way Caitlin had survived the first year of their lives. But the peace was an illusion. As they packed up to leave, a black sedan with tinted windows rolled slowly past the park entrance. The license plate was one Parker recognized instantly. It belonged to a private security firm his mother frequently employed. "Parker, get the boys," Caitlin said, her voice dropping into a low, predatory register. As they reached the edge of the sidewalk, Oliver lagged behind, distracted by a stray feather. The sedan's back window rolled down just a few inches. A hand extended, holding a high-end tablet playing the boy's favorite animated show. "Hey there, little one," a smooth, hired voice cooed from the shadows of the car. "Do you want to see the rest of the show? We have the whole movie in here." Oliver took a step toward the car, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Oliver, no!" Caitlin shouted. Parker moved faster than he ever had in his life. He scooped Oliver up just as the sedan's tires screeched, the car speeding away and disappearing into the city traffic. Parker stood on the sidewalk, his heart hammering against his ribs, clutching his son so tightly the boy let out a small whimper of confusion. "She's trying to snatch them," Parker realized, his face turning a ghostly shade of white. "She's not waiting for the investigation. She's going to take them and disappear to a country without extradition." Caitlin's face didn't show fear. It hardened into something cold, ancient, and indestructible. She looked at the spot where the car had been, her eyes reflecting the steel of the skyscrapers around them. "She thinks she can play a different kind of war now," Caitlin said. "She thinks that because the courtroom is closed for the weekend, she's safe." "What do we do?" Parker asked, his voice trembling. "We can't go back to your apartment. If she's tracking us—" "We stop playing defense," Caitlin replied. "She wants to target my children. Then I'm going to target her heart. We're going back to the evidence Sophia gave us. There were files we didn't use in court, records of her personal bad investments and the way she's been siphoning company capital to cover her losses. If we leak those to the board of directors tonight, they won't just fire her, they'll liquidate her." Caitlin turned to Parker. "You said you wanted to earn your way into their lives. This is how you do it. You know the Winthrop servers better than anyone. We're going to spend the night in my office, and by sunrise there won't be a Winthrop empire left for her to hide in." Parker looked at his sons, then at Caitlin. The cowardice that had defined his life for 30 years finally burned away. "I'm in. Let's finish this." The fall of the Winthrop Empire is a powerful reminder that while money can buy silence, it can never buy loyalty or love. Caitlin and Parker's journey from betrayal to authenticity shows us that the most beautiful lives are often built from the ashes of our greatest challenges. If you were moved by this story of karma, resilience, and the power of a mother's love, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances today. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new cinematic story. Thanks for watching.